You don't know, you better ask somebody. You listening to the Powell Movement.
Welcome to the Powell Movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and I have some really exciting news to share. I'm vaccinated, and I know, in Washington, I don't fit all of the requirements for the shot yet. But I'm part of this crazy Facebook group, Seattle Vaccine Hunters, and the other day I woke up at like 4 a.m. in the morning, and I couldn't go back to sleep, so I decided to work out. And while I was on the bike, I decided to check the Vaccine Hunter page, and boom, there was a sign-up list for waste vaccines. So at 4 a.m., I woke up my wife, and we both signed up, and we are now vaccinated. While I'm still going to be careful about things, I am going to get back to life a little bit. And it all starts with a trip to Bend, Oregon this week for some time at Bachelor, some bike riding, hot tubbing, some 10-barrel, and some still distanced fun. The takeaway from all this is that life is getting back to normal, slowly but surely. And speaking of things getting back to normal, I have a new sponsor who is taking me back to my roots. See, while I have been a lifelong skier with a 7-year break to snowboard, I got into the industry through a totally different route, another fun sport, inline skating. And I'm proud to say that the brand that invented the sport, Rollerblade, has signed on as a sponsor. And if you are a skier and you don't inline skate, well, you're missing out on taking your skiing to the next level. The whole ski to skate thing, it really works, and there's nothing quite like the feel of smooth asphalt on a pair of Rollerblade inline skates. So I'm excited about that, but what I'm really excited about is bringing you part 2 of the Kent Kreitler podcast. It's another good one, and I really need to thank the crew at TGR again for giving me access to their premium service. I watched all of Kent's TGR parts and found some good bonus stuff that I was able to use for this podcast. You can get access to this as well by heading on over to tetongravity.com/premium. It's one of those things where once you see what is on the table, the access to all of TGR's content, the discounts on all their goggles and gear, and access to pro forms that were once only available to industry insiders, this should be an easy yes. And if you haven't poked around the TGR site before, they have more content than anyone, I feel. And that content all started with Kent Kreitler. He was one of the TGR OGs, he's a TGR Hall of Famer, and Kent shared a lot in episode 1, but we only got to 1994, which means that there's a ton of good shit in this episode that you're about to hear. But, like with every episode, I'm prepared to talk about all the topics, but when all is said and done, I can't get to everything. I mean, just because I want to talk about something, it doesn't always fit in the conversation. So in this one, you aren't going to hear about the world extremes in Alaska or deep talks about Kent's biopic movie, Reverence. But what I get is even better, and I'm excited to share it with you. Before I get into it, I want to ask you to follow me on Instagram at The Powell Movement, tell some friends about the show, and support my amazing sponsors. They are Rollerblade, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, the 10-Barrel Brewery, Stanley, and Elan Skis. Now it's time for part 2 with living legend Kent Kreitler. I don't like to start these things out with anything heavy. Actually, a lot of times I do start these things out with something heavy. But this week there was a helicopter accident in Alaska. Greg Harms, among many others, died. I've met Harms. I didn't know him, but I would think that you knew him well. In your words, who did the world lose?
You know what? I didn't know him very well. I just had dinner with Rick Armstrong last night, and he knows him really well. Everyone always asked me if I knew Greg, but he never guided anything I was on. And then, I don't know, we were talking about how me and Kristen, Ulmer, and Shane had been in Portillo with T.R. Youngstrom, and then he went back with Seth and Greg and Steve Winter, and they had that helicopter crash in Portillo. And we were talking last night about how we only know of 2 helicopter crashes really that have killed people. TR died in that one in Portillo, and Greg was in both of them. It's just really sad. And I know a lot of people who know him really well, but I honestly didn't.
Yeah, it's insane that he was in both of those. It's like being struck by lightning twice. The odds of that are incredible, and it's so sad. And, a lot of people are left putting the pieces back together. And that's what happens a lot of times in these sports. Unfortunately, it's usually not an aircraft having a malfunction. It's usually in the mountains themselves. But it is a huge loss, and I'm just going to jump back into the podcast from where we left off last time. And you had already won the U.S. Extremes. You had dropped out of school. I think you were living in your van. And the next big move for you was going to be Lake Tahoe in 1994. that's where things were happening and that's where you needed to be. Did you move there with Shane?
Yeah, we moved out there together. And then his mom owned a bunch of property out there. So even though he hadn't really technically grown up there because he was more of a ski academy kid, he had some roots there and some history. And then because of Stump's movies, really, Squaw was really in the limelight. And then with the advent of snowboarding at that time, Tahoe and Squaw were really central to what was going on in the ski industry. And yeah, just an amazing mountain and really fun place just to be training and skiing and living.
Yeah, it's one of those places where a lot of your heroes came up. And when you move there, are you hyper aware of all the lines that people are getting? And are they aware of what you're doing as well? Is it like a competitive nature in that arena?
In a way, like in a really fun way. I mean, there were so many great skiers there. You know, when we went there, guys like Kevin Andrews were still around. He was an amazing guy from that previous generation. And then a lot of us lived there. You know, a lot of people who are not quite so well known are amazing skiers too. So it's always really, really fun there. We always had such a great time and competitive in a way where, yeah, I mean, there's just so much to do on that mountain that's fun and great for training and good for shooting too. So incredibly fun place to live.
And like you said, snowboarding was picking up and it was popping definitely at that point in the Lake Tahoe area. When is it that you really become aware of what the snowboarders are doing? Like you see them in the park and you're following them in there.
Yeah, that was pretty central to Tahoe. I think the first half pipe was in Tahoe City somewhere. So it was really evolutionary for that sport. And then we were right there pushing the ski industry in the same direction with the same mentality. And the ski industry was just, it seems like the mentality was already there in skiing from, you know, Stump's movies and Plake and some of these people had started to evolve this more free spirited, free skiing side of the sport into more of a professional realm. And then snowboarding just automatically had just so much momentum right off the bat and movement towards really making that side of the sport the core of their sport. Whereas for us, it was so fringe for so long, but it created a lot of kind of co-evolution and camaraderie with those people as well.
Was there any rivalry in Tahoe between the skiers and the snowboarders, or were you guys a crew?
More of a crew. I mean, there's always kind of this funny rivalry that goes on a little bit. But especially, I mean, in my case, I was shooting with TGR, and then TGR was sharing Jeremy Jones's film footage with Standard Films, which at the time, Standard was just really breaking barriers in Big Mountain and had really strong budgets for shooting AK and moving really strong. And so I actually, pretty soon after I moved there, I was filming with all snowboarders with Mike Hatchett and Dave Hatchett and the other filmers who were shooting the snowboard movies with those guys. So I was out with Terje, Hawkinson, and like just all the biggest name snowboarders who were all rolling through Tahoe to shoot with Standard. So for me, it was fun. And I'd shoot with Standard and they give my footage to TGR.
Did any other skiers join you with that, or were you the only skier among the snowboarders in those shoots?
I was the only one. And actually, you know, the snowboarders really have to make their jumps incredibly manicured and perfect. So I don't know, I learned a lot about jump building and it was great going out with those guys. Then the Hatchets and I had a good relationship. I was quite a charger. So he kind of liked to have me around because he'd be like, all right, as soon as you're ready to hit the jump, let's get these guys going, you know, kind of get the momentum going. Because I was actually more of a regular. You know, back then, like Tom Burt was actually on some of those shoots and we were shooting big mountain stuff. And he's just such an elder in the snowboard community. And yeah, I was the only one. Yeah.
And this is all pre-New Canadian Air Force, so there's nobody out there skiing on twin tips or really pushing the sport yet. You're kind of that first guy.
Yeah, it happened a little bit simultaneously, but we had like actually a really good ski park skiing crew. And no one in the ski industry was really paying attention to what we were doing for a year or two or more. But we were out there every day. And one of the great things about Squaw is that the mountain stays open so late. You know, I'm from Sun Valley and I'm back there now. And even Jackson shuts down this week. Sun Valley shuts down this week. But for park skiing and training, springtime's the best. And Squaw used to stay open, you know, well into June. And I remember we had a huge year where we stayed open until July 4th. And it was a great place to be evolving the whole park scene, as is Whistler, where the Canadian guys were coming from. But yeah, there was some things that happened simultaneously.
But if you look at it, like your Obermeyer ad came out in 94 with you grabbing your skis. So that was something that probably happened before those guys. And then you've gone on record saying that you're the first skier that you've ever heard of going into the terrain park. You're doing cork threes that progresses to sevens and nines, and you're doing them on 215 downhill boards. It's fucking crazy.
I mean, back then, the parks used to be no skiers allowed. So, half the time you'd go in there until you got kicked out. Squaw was always open, but sometimes I remember visiting my buddy Dave Basterchia in Aspen, and the Aspen Park was closed to skiers. And I remember Shane and I went up to Hood just to go skiing, and we skied Shasta, and then we skied Hood, and we drop in and poach the snowboard camp park and do a quick run through and throw a backflip and just keep going and have people yelling at us.
And in Tahoe, everybody's more welcoming, though, it sounds like. It sounds like it's more part of the tribe there. And one thing in Tahoe that I've kind of noticed is that it's one of those places that everybody frosts on a powder day, but there's also a lot of night skiing per se, if you know what I mean. People like to party. It's sex, drugs, and rock and roll in Tahoe. And what's life like for a young, white, dreadlocked Kent Kreitler? Are you going out and just living the life back then?
We used to all go out almost every night. And then, Brad Holmes is a local fixture there. So you had guys like Holmes, and on the snowboarding side, Sean Farmer, and just some real strong leadership in the very loose, kind of hardcore, pretty punk. We kind of grew up Gen X-y and more punk. So Seth Morrison and I and some of the snowboarders and Holmes, we had more of that influence from being kind of out of the punk Gen X generation too. But yeah, Tahoe was great. It was very fun. Great place to be. And yeah, lots of gals and guys out all the time. And it was super affordable. There were, hundreds of people who lived there who were young people in their 20s.
Just living that lifestyle, sending it at night, sending it all day as well.
Yeah, kind of carrying on that 70s freestyle modus operandi where the sport it's still that way, but these towns have gotten so much more expensive that they've changed a bit where a lot of that funky culture isn't there so much.
And the sports have gotten a little bit more serious, it seems like. The people that are at your level now, I'm not going to say they're a different type of person, but they, I think, treat their bodies a little bit differently than you guys did back then.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference between millennials and Gen Xers. To be honest, I mean, I did have a good self-care. I did train really hard and prioritize my skiing. So for me, one of the reasons I did well is that I was grounded in health and wellness as well as having a good time.
And you had come off winning the U.S. Extremes. You're in Tahoe. And this is when world travel really starts to ramp up for you. I mean, you've done South America, but at the end of that first year in Tahoe, you head to New Zealand for the World Heli Challenge. You win that one too. And with all these international trips that you start going on, when you look back on it, is it one of those things where people pick you up at the airport, you shred for a few days, party at night, ski in the day, party at night, repeat, and then fly out? Or are you able to actually get some culture in these places that you're going?
I guess 94, 95, things weren't taking off so much. There weren't as many opportunities. So, I would just pull together money. I remember I flew to New Zealand. I think it was 94. I spent most of the summer in New Zealand. I moved in with this guy, Paul Ahern. He held the biggest air, the biggest jump after Paul Ruff died. This is before Jamie Pierre, but Paul Ruff jumped off of something that was, 120 or, something like Julian Carr does all the time, probably.
Yeah.
But I lived with Paul and this guy, Denny. And, I just lived in Queenstown. I was snowboarding a ton back then. And I even, we were talking about the Squaw Park scene. I used to go up and ride the half pipe and be on my snowboard quite a bit. And I remember I wasn't really filming that summer. I was just living there and riding every day and just cruising with these other local pro snowboarder and skiers and just going up to the hill every day at Cardrona and road tripping over to Wanaka. And then as time went on, you just try to get money out of the industry to create a shoot, create some kind of a package that's going to go into Powder Magazine or one of the magazines and take a photographer. And, it eventually came to just getting the trip funded and creating the business around it and making it appealing to sponsors to kick down the money to pay to go on these trips.
And you guys had to build the sport, it seemed like, because you were starting to build momentum behind skiing because skiing was dead in the water at one point. Snowboarding had taken over. And it's like you and your crew are the ones who are bringing the sport back, and you have to get the brands on board because the athletes and the filmers, they get it. They get what's going to happen to skiing, but the people making the big decisions in the boardrooms don't. And when I think about that, I think about sponsorship, and it looks like at this point, Volant seems to be all over Shane. And I remember seeing some footage of you when you're on Salomon Superforce 9s in like 93. When did you stop skiing Volant?
Right around that time, I was on Salomon for the year that I won the U.S. Extremes that first time. And then, I just started looking at things from a business perspective, and I really liked what K2 was doing. And I could see that at the time, K2 was really the only company that was investing. They were heavily invested in Plake and Schmidt, and Mike Hatrip was on that program as well, I think. And so I went with K2 because I just felt like there was more potential for growth there. And they actually put together a really fun team, and they were listening to us. And despite the Salomon 1080, like K2 did produce the first twin tip, which was not a great ski. It was called the Poacher, and it was smaller, but K2 was listening to us. They were one of the companies that saw that, they had athletes that were making them money. And so for me, I went with them because I just felt like there was opportunity and they were paying attention.
Well, rumor has it that you called up K2 and you either talked to marketing or left a message with someone and said, hey, it's time for Plake, Hatrip, and Schmidt to pass the torch to the new era of skiers. There's no truth to that at all?
I think Mike Hatrip said something about that. We put that interview in the movie, but not really. I mean, there's so many discussions that go down. And, one thing I learned quickly as a pro athlete is that people like to take the one most controversial soundbite that you say out of a 30-minute interview and use that instead of everything else. So I don't know. I was never like disrespectful in any way to those guys. I really respected them. So I'm not exactly sure what was said, but I know there's much more respect was paid to them than trying to ever take anything away.
Sure. And at that point, skiers had been marketed as racers, and the brands weren't really marketing them as personalities like skateboarding and other sports had done. When you get to K2, that's the whole theme behind the K2 team is like, we're going to take a collection of personalities that are totally different, bring them together and create strength and unity in this core group of skiers, and we're going to market it as a team. Was that something that everybody bought into right away? And who was that first team?
I mean, it was slow. Like you said, the ski industry was dead in a lot of ways. And it was really frustrating because there were a small group of people who had the vision, literally hundreds of pro snowboarders and people just pumping money into snowboarding. And then you have, it was down to like 10 to 20 skiers who were really trying to get these companies to do things. And it was really hard, even with K2, because at the time they had Bodie on board and, they were also focused on other things, but it was just incredibly challenging to get them to listen to us. The writing on the wall was so obvious to us that the industry needed to make that pivot into free skiing and into focusing on what we were doing and what snowboarding was really bringing to the table that the ski industry wasn't acknowledging that was already in skiing before. I mean, skiing started that. Skiing started the extreme and the personality thing and everything else. It went way back, but they never really wanted to capitalize on that. It was, like you said, always very race focused.
And then you had Shane and your crew, and it seemed like Shane was rallying a crew of pros against the industry. He was pretty much writing a manifesto of how the industry is old and they don't know what they're doing and they need to listen to the athletes. And I would think that you're a big part of that.
Yeah, I think all of us were a big part of that. And then I started Boards in Motion magazine simultaneous with Jake Witt starting Freeze. And I was actually at those original conceptions meetings for Freeze, but we were already kind of had the wheels turning on doing it independently. I mean, we were all involved in different ways. Like Shane was really involved in the IFSA and the competitive side. So just different people kind of focusing on different areas to try to make it happen.
Now it's time for me to roll out my sponsors, and I'm going to start with my new sponsor, Rollerblade. And there are so many reasons to get into inline skating. It's so much easier on the body compared to running. It's one of the best total body activities out there. It makes exercise fun. And for skiers, it's the only thing that creates the same muscle movements and carving motions that happen on your skis. Like I mentioned in the intro, the whole skate to ski thing works, and Rollerblade has built a program around it over the years that will keep you fit and, more importantly, get you ready for ski season. To find out more about Rollerblade and skate to ski, Download the Rollerblade app or head on over to rollerblade.com. My next sponsor has been with me forever, the 10 Barrel Brewery out of Bend, Oregon. While there are a lot of copycat breweries out there, 10 Barrel has supported ski, snowboard, and bike since they started in Bend back in 2006. And since then, they have not only been brewing the tastiest beers to come out of the Northwest, Profuse Juice being my favorite, but they've supported so much in action sports. Protect Our Winners, the Surf Rider Foundation, and so many other rad properties and events, along with an all-time team of athletes. 10 Barrel supports EJack, Lucas Walks, Curtis Cizik, Carson Storch, Ben Ferguson, Brittany White, and brand new to the team is a Powell Movement alum, Kate Zelef. 10 Barrel really puts their money where their mouth is, and they do things the right way, so support the beer that supports what you do. You can find out more about the athletes, the events, and everything 10 Barrel over at 10barrel.com. My final sponsor this round is one of my favorites, Stanley. And we may as well start their ad with the most important part. I'm going to save you 30% on all Stanley products. This is an amazing deal that can be unlocked with the code DRINKFAST. That's all one word and lowercase. And you use it when you check out at stanley1913.com. And if you spend over $200 with that code DRINKFAST, Stanley will also ship you a Powell Movement beanie with your order. It's a limited edition beanie, and Stanley's an amazing brand that I hope you know about. They're the ones that invented the category of keeping things hot and cold back in 1913. Think about that green bottle that used to keep your grandpa's coffee hot. That's the Stanley I'm talking about. They make all the things that you're going to need for your parking lot lunch sessions at the ski hill and your summer camping and RVing adventures. So head on over to stanley1913.com for that deal. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. So that's interesting to me that Freeze is created by Jaquit, and it's a magazine that you're going to be a big part of. You're going to have a ton of coverage within Freeze. But in Tahoe, at the same time, you start Boards in Motion. And is there just no communication between you two guys? Or are you guys feeling that, like, with more magazines, it's going to help build the industry and make it stronger? Like, are you guys playing on the same playing field?
Let's see. I can't remember the year on that, but there was a little bit of division that happened because
96.
Yeah. So our whole thing with Freeze was like, hey, Freeze is corporate. These are the guys who are against us. Like, why are you guys starting a magazine with Times Mirror? We should be doing this independently all together and then owning it and going out there and like creating this on our own and capitalizing on it from our own, not just selling out right off the bat to a big magazine company, which was part of Ski and Skiing conglomerate. And then that was also kind of a Tahoe thing, but we were fiercely kind of independent and just kind of had more of a fuck you attitude. Like, there was a lot of feeling on my part and a lot of people's part, like our industry was letting us down and that we just needed to evolve our industry on our own because they weren't listening. So there was actually kind of this split that happened where Freeze was super aligned with MSP, and then Boards in Motion became very aligned with TGR. And so there was kind of like this split that happened where Freeze really latched onto the Canadian Air Force and MSP, and like they really started marketing like a specific group of people. And then we tried to stay pretty open and market everyone, but we wanted to cover like a lot more of the fringe things that we felt were important, like more the core rebellious side of what was happening in the sport.
And you know what's happening in the sport is 94, 95 shape skis are coming into play. The Elan SCX has already changed a lot of people's minds. It's not the right ski for you guys at that time, but development is going into place, and they are developing skis that you guys are going to want to ski, I believe. And are you involved in the development of the product? Like, you have a pro model with K2, one of the first pro models that K2 ever does. Do you get the ski you want? Do they build what Kent Kreitler wants to ski on?
No, not really. And you probably remember you brought up the Elan. There was this whole thing on, oh my God, like tons of side cut is going to save the ski industry. So everyone went crazy on side cut, and we, and then we're back there like, okay, well, this has nothing to do with what we're trying to do. And then I had very little design input. They were like, this is what's going to sell. So let's put your graphic on this and do this. And I never really had like the input I wanted on most of my pro models. My last one was with Blizzard, and I was literally in the Blizzard. I flew to Austria. I was in there. I was like, this is what we want to build. And it was like basically exactly what the skis became a couple of years later. I was like tiny bit of rocker on the back, a little bit on the front. And they were just like, we can't do that. Like, that'll never sell. That's never going to catch on, And so I didn't have that input that Shane had with Volant, where they were like, okay, well, let's just do whatever you say and just try it. Like with K2, my first prototypes, like on Harvest, I was up in AK. I was on these skis that were super side cut, but pretty wide at the tip and the tail, but way too much side cut, which on really steep spines and things, you get hung up because your tips and your tails have way more contact with the snow than the middle of your ski.
Yep.
So anyway, it was kind of frustrating because honestly, I didn't have very much luck getting built what I wanted built at any time.
So when it comes out, are you proud of having a pro model, or are you kind of embarrassed because it's not the ski you want, or are you just like, fuck it, I'm going to ski it anyway?
Yeah, there's kind of a combination of that where I'm not going to discredit the ski industry. Like, they're in it more. And so, I mean, like the Volant skis that Shane developed hardly sold. So from the perspective of the ski industry, like, in a way they were right. Like, they know what's going to sell at that time, because you put something out that's too progressive, it takes a while to catch on. So these early ideas that I wanted to implement, like, no one would implement them. And then 3 years later, they were the bomb, and even with the twin tip with K2, right off the bat with the Poacher, we said, this thing's way too small and way too flimsy. Like, this isn't what we need. And they were, for some reason, there's this thing with the ski industry where back then they always thought they knew better to a large extent. So it was frustrating. I did with Spider. I switched to Spider, and we had at first it was the Kent Kreitler line. And then I was like, hey, let me build a team. I was always like a real team player. I always wanted to do things to help the sport and other athletes. And, I did Spider kind of independently for a few years. And then I was like, hey, if we're going to build this program, like, we need to add athletes and build this. So then we switched the line to Venom. It started out as Kreitler for 2 years, and then it was Venom. And I brought Seth on board, and Micah, and Jamie Burge, and Shane Anderson, Clint Fiala, like, built that team. And finally, all of a sudden, it's like, okay, Spider's not just Kreitler. It's like they're serious and they're behind this. And they actually latched onto it and did it right. That line did really well for a couple of years. And then Spider being Spider and being so ski race centered, it was tough to keep that focus. But I ended up with them my whole career, and they did treat me really well. And that brand, from my perspective, was more fun. And they did listen. And we'd have meetings. We'd go into meetings. We'd tell them what we wanted. And they'd do a lot of it.
I had no idea that Team Venom was you. And in thinking of it, I mean, Spider is moving so much product. And when you have a signature line with them, I mean, is Spider where you're making the most money at retail from product incentive?
Yeah, well, Spider was my I had equivalent contracts, but Spider was my biggest contract. And, by the way, I got to give credit to Billy Jacobs. Dave Jacobs started Spider. Billy and Jake were his sons. And Billy Jacobs is the one. He started Strike, which was the Spider snowboard line. He got Venom going. Like, you got to give credit to these industry guys, like the Jeff Maturas at K2. Like, there's certain people who were in-house who got it, who finally started to make things happen in-house. But yeah, Spider was by far my most consistent and just best sponsor over the years. They were great.
In thinking of contracts and sponsors, I think you've been on record before saying you made a couple $100,000 a year, like in the peak of your skiing or somewhere around then, which is awesome. But in thinking of photo incentive, because that was a huge thing back then, and you've got Freeze magazine, but then you've got Boards in Motion magazine. Having your own magazine, does that ensure you're going to max out your photo incentive contracts with every magazine as well?
Oh, yeah. No, I tried to be pretty good about not over-publishing myself in Boards in Motion. But I got to a point where I kind of established myself, and people knew I was a really hard worker. So I did start out with photo incentive things happening, and I moved away from that more over time because I just, I started just saying, look, I just want to get paid and just go out there. You guys know I work hard, and, I'm just going to do whatever I can do.
And you have to keep track of that too, I would think. You probably have to clip magazine clippings and make sure the team manager knows that you've got all these shots, which is probably a hassle for you at the end of the day.
Yeah, and then things started getting so international that it's hard to keep track of what gets published because you don't know what's happening in France and Germany and Japan. And it gets to a point where it's like things are really starting to move internationally, and it's hard to even keep track of it all. So, yeah, I kind of moved towards doing less and less of that over time.
And as you go less and less, if Boards in Motion eventually goes away as well, what's the reason behind the magazine? Is it just too much shit going on in your world to keep it going?
I think I lost like $30,000 on that magazine.
Oh, shit.
We couldn't sell the advertising. It was too early. And Freeze could stay alive because They were functioning at a loss for years, and they had the Times Mirror behind them, and they made it happen. Whereas like we were just independent. We could not get people to advertise. It was just too early. The ski industry still wasn't into it.
And what do you think about the state of print right now? Because it's crazy that there's a few different magazines coming back with Mountain Gazette and Bomb Snow. But in the grand scheme of things, Powder is gone and there's not that many ski magazines. What do you think about print? Do you ever read it anymore?
I enjoy print, but I kind of really got to where when I quit as a professional in 2008, I really just didn't want anything to do with professional skiing anymore.
Yeah.
And I don't read them. I don't even follow many people on Instagram. I feel like the whole social media phenomenon is great. Everything's changed and, I'm just a different generation. But I feel like the problem with the social media thing is that all the pros are publishing like so much kind of things I don't really care about seeing. But I know that teenagers want to see it and people in their 20s want to see it. But I don't want to see every little thing that someone does. I'd rather go and see the TGR movie. So from the print magazine perspective, the best thing about the magazines is that they actually procure the, really relevant, great press. Whereas with social, it's just like anything goes. Everyone's got to pump out new material like almost daily. So it's just a different animal. And I'm a different generation. I like going to the TGR movie. I like going to the MSP movie. I like seeing just like the best footage of the year, but I don't need to see everything in between.
No, I hear you there. And so the magazine doesn't last, but it's finally like you guys have gotten skiing back on its feet and it's going to be great again. And a cool thing about you is while you're known for the big mountain film stuff that we talked about in the first episode that we did, you're also known for hitting park jumps, but no one ever showed that stuff of you, so not as many people knew. But the skier across thing was another thing that you did. And in 1998, you win the silver, I think, at the X Games and the skier across, but it was a complete and utter shit show. 13 of 30 competitors were injured. And what happened at that event? What went wrong?
Yeah, before that, we had like Lord of the Boards. Chris Ernst had these events going. So we've been doing some of it. Basically the courses then were built for snowboarders and they were throwing 6 skiers into them. And it was just way too much of a clusterfuck. And I was like, I like skier cross and I was a good racer. And had I decided to make that my discipline, which is kind of where it went, like, my discipline, I was like, okay, what are my disciplines? Big mountain is what I really love. And I really love doing tricks in the park. And I was like, I can't take on a third discipline. I could be really good at this, but it's just not what I want to put my energy into. But yeah, the early skier crosses were a mess because they were throwing the skiers in the snowboard courses and the skiers are going way faster, overshooting all the jumps. Yeah, it was kind of crazy. And actually, that one that I got second in was classic because Dean Cummings was actually right in front of me going into the last jump and he thought he had second nailed down and he like went up really high. He popped it and threw a twister and I pre-jumped it and passed him in the air and went into second place.
Oh man, it's like a Lindsay Jacobellis type thing, but not as bad as hers.
But yeah, they were pretty mayhem. It was kind of mayhem, the early events.
Yeah, and there's the next one, I think, where you end up going to X Games and you're in the big air, which is amazing because, like I said, TGR wasn't showing that footage of you in the park back then, so not everybody knew what kind of tricks you had. But then you're in a big air event with Candide, Johnny Mosley, and you were never in the conversation. And then you show up in this big air. What kind of tricks are you throwing at the big air?
I've been throwing this corked double spinning backflip thing. And to be honest, I choked pretty hard. And they had this little tiny big air jump at that event. And yeah, I completely choked when I showed up for that first one. But yeah, those guys were in it. But my game was not together and I did not do well. And like you said, my thing is like, I was always, even if it was big mountain or park, as soon as I'd figure something out, I really wanted to go on record as having done something. And so like with those early corked out 3s and 720s, the reason I have there's one photo, I think I sent it to you at some point, but I got Hank DeVries and I was like, Hank, you got to come up here and shoot this stuff with me. So I've got these photos doing the cork 7s on, the 215 downhill skis. So I always tried to get out there to document stuff because it was kind of a race to progress in a way on some of that stuff, new grabs, new tricks. So you try to get it documented, but then no one would publish it.
But it's important that you got it documented now because now it exists and you can show it. Not that you have to prove it because you're not one of those dudes that's going to throw it out there for everybody, but it's nice to know. Back to the X Games. In that second skier cross, I think you ended up blowing your knee in it. And is that the first big injury for you?
Yeah, that was my first big injury. And I had one other really major. I dislocated my knee and basically tore the bottom of my leg off. But yeah, so I had that ACL injury that one took me out for the season.
So we might as well talk about both of them, though. So that one takes you out for the season. Do you have health insurance when you have your first knee injury?
Yeah, and I had a great surgeon, and I did an Achilles tendon cadaver. That's my left knee, and that's been great. I've never had a problem with it since then. It's all about rehab's super important.
And then there's the really big knee injury where you destroy everything within your knee in Alaska. You mess up your femur as well. What happens there?
On the recovery, or how did it happen?
How'd you do it? Because the recovery, no one wants to hear about the recovery because it just sucks thinking about you working out every day in a gym, getting strong.
Yeah. It was actually really a great idea. We were up there in January, which is really early for the Alaska heli season. And we were in Girdwood, and it was me and Scogan and Todd Jones, I think. And Mike Overcast from Jackson was our guide. And we were doing these 6-hour windows when the sun was out because there's hardly any sun that time of year. And we were just doing this little side shot. It was nothing very exciting. And I just saw this cliff and I said, I'll hit this thing and, let's just get this shot before we head to the bottom. And, it was one of those things where I didn't really calculate it. I didn't really take a good look at it. And I screwed up and it wasn't even anything very big. And I just landed short, hit some rocks on the way down at the bottom of the cliff face. And then I'm not even really sure where the knee came apart. I just started cartwheeling and then I could just feel my leg kind of flopping after a couple cartwheels and ended up with my right leg just like hanging to the inside, to the interior of my leg, and my tibia was basically in front of my tib fib plateau was in front of the bottom of my femur.
Oh.
They were just completely disconnected and the patella tendon was torn in half and everything else tore out. So it was a nightmare.
How do they get you off the mountain in a situation like that? Because I would think that, you're in shock at first, but then the pain kicks in and you got to get out of there.
Yeah, I'd done a couple heli rescues previously. I was with Adam Hostetter when he broke his leg in Alaska. He's a snowboarder, Jeremy Jones's cousin. And then with Gordy'd blown his knee on Tomahawk up in Haines. And so I'd done that evac or been part of that. And so I kind of knew a little bit about what that program looked like. And I was on this steeper slope and Overcast came. And so my leg's hanging off sideways and he just like wrapped it because we didn't want it to move. Luckily, my femoral artery didn't break or I probably would have internally bled out. I don't know how that didn't snap, but he just like wrapped the ACE bandage really tight around everything. And then they were like, okay, we got to move you down to a flat spot. And I was like, no, you guys, let's dig a platform right here. So what you do is you dig a place for the heli to land and you dig a place for the blades. So the blades aren't going to strike. And I was like, let's not move me very far. And I kind of a little bit took control of the situation when it was like, all right, let's just like land the helicopter as close as possible to here because I was in so much pain and my leg was so jacked. So we did that. And then Overcast is this huge, super strong guy. And everyone kind of pulled the back seats out of the helicopter and stuffed me in the back of the helicopter and flew me back out. But it was sketchy. It was late in the day. It's just not a good scene. Yeah, anyway, I got out of there and everything worked out.
My next sponsor break starts with Peter Glenn Ski and Sports. And for over 60 years, Peter Glenn has been getting people out there. And this week, they're going to protect your eyes along the way. That's right. Peter Glenn is giving away 2 pair of Smith Emerge sunglasses. And you can head out there rocking their ChromaPop polarized lenses that cut glare and enhance color and contrast. To enter this one, head on over to Peter Glenn's Instagram and follow both Peter Glenn and Smith. From there, like the Smith giveaway post and tag 2 friends in the comments and you're in. If you don't win, you can always get the best prices on everything Smith and countless other brands over at peterglenn.com. My final sponsor is Elan Skis, and they have been building a cult following in the States for a few years now. Why? Because their skis are better than everyone else's. And believe me, I worked at a ski manufacturer for 16 years. I know what a quality product looks like when it comes out of the factory, and you aren't going to get any better quality than you're going to find with your Elan skis. And that's just the craftsmanship. They ski even better. They're rock solid underfoot at the highest of speeds, yet still lightweight, and there's no chatter at all. And in just a few months, I can feel my skiing getting better. And that's no joke. You will feel the same thing. To find out more about all things Elan, head on over to elanskis.com. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. When you get hurt like that, you're on Rossignol at this point. Do they stand by you throughout the injury and then you part ways with them? Or how does that work with them? Because it seems like you're on Rossi, but when you get healthy, you're not on Rossi anymore.
Didn't have that much to do with that. It was more like Cooperthwaite, who was a great team manager. He was one of those guys who really helped us. He's with Stokely now, but he was one of those early inside industry guys, George Cooperthwaite, who really made things happen. And he was with Rossi. And then Rossignol went to this phase where the French kind of took back over their U.S. team. And then Hugo Harrison was kind of their big deal. They'd really kind of taken the attention off Manu Guenet. Manu was winning the world free skiing stuff. So they were kind of focused all their energy on their French Canadian guys and on their French guy. And I was kind of like, all right. And George was off. So it seemed like the U.S. team had kind of dwindled. You know, Candide might have been on the program by then. I think he was with Rossi for a while.
Yeah, he was for a while.
So I felt like I was kind of getting pushed down the ladder there. So that's why I ended up looking for something new. And then, you know, once again, it comes down to money. And my contract was up and I just shopped for a better deal.
And when you left K2 to go to Rossi, I mean, how did that end? Because K2 seemed like a perfect match for you. You were with a team that fit your personality and fit what skiing was going to be. I mean, K2 had their finger on the pulse better than any other brand, maybe other than Line, it seemed like. And They had their finger on the pulse of every different category of the sport. They even got out of race because they were like, you know what? We don't even want to deal with these guys anymore. They're too much prima donnas who are taking all the money, and we don't sell any race skis. We're going to stick by these Kent Kreitlers, these Seth Morrisons. How does K2 end?
I don't know. I loved K2, and I actually started getting some skis from them again after I retired. But you're right. I mean, that was my best match. Part of that was like, it seems like they were lagging on the ski design, on the big mountain ski design. They just couldn't really get it right on the fat skis.
Okay.
You know, and once again, like Cooperthwaite was at Rossignol. He was another great guy like Jeff Mature at K2, who was really making things happen. And I think Cooperthwaite kind of swooned me over to Rossi and gave me a really good deal. I think I had a 3-year deal and he just put me on a great 3-year deal, and K2 didn't want to match it. So I just rolled, which I didn't like making those jumps. Having that lifelong or career-long alliance is the best place to be. But, you know, I just had a different opportunity arise and I made that jump.
Yeah, that happens. People make choices in their careers. And you know what? You probably weren't going to make more money with K2, and you were going to make more money elsewhere because you were definitely in demand at that point. So money does talk at that point, and whatever, you can look back and be like, oh, K2 was a great match, but you did what you had to do for your career. Another thing in your career, we talked about it a little bit before, is you had a tight relationship with Doug Coombs. And he was older, but a legendary dude who just had so much knowledge in the mountains. And he dies in the French Alps, and it's a weird death where his partner at the time goes over a cliff, and he was going to actually look over, doing something he shouldn't do, to go see where Chad was. And he ends up dying as well. How tough is it to deal with a dude who's not just a peer, but he's like a mentor and a peer to you?
Well, it just made me feel more vulnerable. You know, for a lot of years, I felt pretty immortal and probably got away with some things. And then like Doug was just so intelligent and skilled and such a skilled mountaineer and guide and everything else. And so you get someone like that who goes and makes a mistake and dies, and it makes you realize like anything could happen. You know, he really knew what he was doing. He was probably, you know, he's one of the top guides in the world and most knowledgeable big mountain skiers. And Doug, for years, he guided for Hatchet with those early snowboard standard film strips. Mike Hatchet got out a couple years before TGR did and started hitting these really big lines in Alaska. And that was all with Doug guiding, you know, and it just really made me aware of the fact that there were dangers that existed that I may not be able to control.
Are you saying with those standard films and Doug going out and guiding, are those like the Farmer and Palmer days of them heading out to Alaska, like just in Sorels? Is that when Doug's with them?
No, it was more, he had like, Andy Hetzel.
Yep.
You know who? Oh gosh, small blonde-haired guy from Tahoe. I can't remember his name. And then some of the European riders, but it wasn't Parada. It might have been some Farmer in there. Daniel Frank. I mean, he kind of brought some of his jib athletes up there, but then he had some core big mountain snowboard guys who were great.
And I heard that Doug could snowboard as well. I interviewed Jeff Ament from Pearl Jam, and Jeff went on a trip where Doug was the guide, and Doug was skiing most of the time, but Jeff has a picture of Doug, and I think it was in Alaska, snowboarding, and he's like, he told me never to share this or show this to anybody. Or, he's like, I could talk about it, but I couldn't get it published, but he could snowboard pretty well.
Yeah, I think he could. I think I remember that. I remember when we were down in Las Leñas for that first extreme event, I had my snowboard with me, and I think Doug and I were actually snowboarding together, hitting a bunch of lines before the comp started. But yeah, I think I might have even snowboarded with him. I can't remember for sure.
That would be some classic footage of you and Coombs snowboarding. It would be amazing to have.
Yeah. I was out on my snowboard yesterday.
So you're in Jackson right now?
Yeah.
Nice. So in your career at this point, you're on Blizzard, you're still getting paid. I think you're still getting paid well. You're living in Switzerland, and you're kind of, I would think, reevaluating everything because you've lost Doug, and that kind of makes you think a lot more. Is this also around the same time that you start going to Burning Man?
No, I went to Burning Man in 1997.
Oh, damn.
Yeah, it was one of the first, or it was pretty early in the Burning Man circuit. So I'd been a bunch of times. 2008 with Switzerland, I kind of knew I was going to retire. I wasn't really sure, but I needed a downtime year. It was like so full throttle year after year. And maybe it was part of my demise, but I just wanted to live in one place and not be traveling all the time and filming. And so I did photos, but I decided not to film that year. I just wanted to take a mellower year. And then I ended up pulling the plug after that year. But I had a fantastic season in Engelberg, kind of just skiing with all the local guys. And I basically told my sponsors that I did a couple photo shoots and got some great footage going. But for photos, I said, I'll take care of all my ad stuff, but I'm not going to do any film segments this year. And that, I don't think they were very happy about that. And then I just pulled the plug because I started trying to renegotiate some contracts, and everything was getting lowered. And there were a bunch of hot new athletes. It was 2008. And then I felt like the whole time I was a pro athlete, I was always trying to prove my value. And then by that point, I was so established as one of the older, successful athletes, I felt more like I should be able to ride it out a little bit. And there wasn't a lot of receptivity to, we're going to keep you on board and you can do less than you used to do. So that was when I pulled the plug because I really felt like I'd accomplished all of my goals, really. And it wasn't like I was going to stop. It was just psychologically, I wasn't ready to just throttle like I did for literally 15 years.
Do you think it has to do with getting older and realizing, because, when you're 18 to 28, you're invincible. Nothing is going to happen to you whatsoever. Even if it does, you are going to get better and you're going to be fine and do it all over again. But when you start getting up there and you see that Doug goes and the next year you're going to see McConkey go, which we'll talk about in a minute, but the shelf life of a pro skier and the risk level, is that kind of what makes you want to bow out?
Yeah, part of that. And then I felt like the expectations on me were the same as they ever were. And I was not willing to try. It's hard. Like I wanted to settle down a little bit, so to speak. That was part of just taking that whole year in Switzerland with my girlfriend at the time. And yeah, the expectations were basically the same. And I just wasn't willing to do what I'd been doing for 15 years.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like I used the word gnarly like 800 times in our last podcast, but every year you're expected to get gnarlier. And if you don't, then the team manager, when it's contract time, is going to look at what you've put out for the past couple of years. And he's not thinking, this is the legendary Kent Kreitler who really doesn't need to ski a day next year. People are still going to buy product because he's the legendary Kent Kreitler. They're looking at your part like, he really didn't send it like he has been in years past. And we're probably not going to get a good segment out of him next year. Why don't we invest in another athlete and we'll put him in the movie? And that was time with Kent Kreitler, because skiing doesn't really stick by its heroes other than Glenn Plake, it seems like.
Yeah, those real original guys. I don't know. I feel like some people, I don't know what Sage is up to now, but I feel like he's mellowing out a little bit. And I feel like there's a little more of that sort of like surf mentality where if you've been in the industry long enough, they're a little more accommodating now to realizing that at the retail level, it's interesting. Like really you're trying to sell product to buyers for the major retailers
Yep.
or all the retailers. And so, I have these buyers who are older, and in a way, like, you want to keep your sages and your guys who have been around for a while around, just because those people at retail know them. And then they're putting things on the shelves that half the consumers are just there to buy whatever's available. But at that time in 2008, there were a lot of younger new skiers. And I feel like the industry was just still kind of not at that level of maturity, even though like Schmidt, he had some lifetime deal, I think, with North Face, and he's with Stokely. And I don't know what Glenn's doing now.
He's Elan.
Yeah. So I didn't feel that support, or they weren't accommodating in that way. And the ski industry is always tough anywhere, and maybe any industry, but marketing director seems to be like the fastest turning over position there is. And it's hard as an athlete. Like, you're constantly dealing with a new marketing director whose job is basically to come in and revamp things and start things over and like make something new out of the brand. And so I think one of the things that a lot of people experience, or a lot of the athletes experience, is they're in really good with a company, and then all of a sudden some internal positions change, or a couple change, but especially the marketing director position. And you got to kind of deal with a new person who has a new vision. And that's why some of my transitions happened as well, by the way.
Which sucks, because the new marketing director should know the history of the sport and the athletes within the sport. And I get that your contracts might go down a little bit. Hey, you're not going to be producing exactly what you produced before. And I can see a team manager coming in like, hey, Kent, man, we want to do everything we can to hold on to you. You're a legend in the sport. We know you're not going to be doing what you did before, and that's why the number is like this. But we want to keep it for a long time and just be Kent Kreitler for life on the brand. But people weren't doing that with you, which kind of sucks, because they definitely could have, and you will sell product, but that's just how it is. I think the next big thing in your life, because you kind of call it quits for skiing there, it's like you've retired after Switzerland. And then the next year, the most important person in your skiing history, I feel like, is Shane McConkey. Just like your lives are parallel together. And I don't know if like during your careers where Shane is always doing something that you can die doing, where you're skiing and he's doing some gnarly shit while he's skiing. But then when you're not skiing, he's jumping off just about everything that there is to jump off and putting his life at risk at all times. Are you doing that with him when you're younger, jumping off shit?
Yeah, well, we did like our first, we were in college, we did this bungee. We actually used, Jacob was there too. We did our first, this is when bungee jumping was super new. I think Shane tracked down some guy. He took us to some bridge, and I don't even know where he went, somewhere in southern Colorado, and jumped off this bridge on bungee cords. And then like we did some cool stuff. I had these roommates in Tahoe who were really early, like Jimbo Morgan, who guides at Points North, was one of the pioneer bungee jumping guys ever, like started at the same time as AJ Hackett, but just was doing it undercover on these military cords. So we'd go and like, put our crew together and go jump off these bridges down around in different places outside of Tahoe. And at one point we jumped the Golden Gate.
Whoa.
Yeah, I was doing some of that stuff, but when Shane started doing the bait, I basically knew that if I got into skydiving, and that like, I just knew because I took a lot of risk skiing. I trained for it so my body could take impacts and I could take messing up pretty well and falling. But I just knew for me, like to get into the air sports, I knew I'd kill myself. So I just stayed away.
And eventually that's what happens with Shane. He goes in, and where are you? And how do you take that when someone that close to you dies doing what they love or not? It doesn't even matter. It's just they're gone, and that sucks. How do you deal with it?
I don't know. It was a strange time because I had really left the ski industry, and I'd written Shane Shane and I were pretty competitive with each other. Like, we're like brothers. And I felt like he was pushing really hard to keep his place in the ski industry. You know, he had knee injuries and a back thing. And I think part of the reason he was basing and doing so much jumping is that his skiing was pretty challenged, like in what he could continue to do without remember he had his big hip dislocation.
Yep.
Like horrible accident. I mean, his body was just trash. And so being in the air on a wing was his avenue, to stay in the game. And I felt like he was just doing some really dangerous stuff. And I wrote him a letter, letting him know that I was retiring because I just wanted to be clear that I was taking a step in a different direction. And I let him know that I'd love to do some guiding and like start doing some sort of outside of the performance thing as pro athletes together. Because I just really felt like I felt like there was a good chance he was going to end up killing himself. And then when it happened, I got to say, like, I wasn't super shocked. Like, that's part of why I wrote that letter to him, as I was like kind of just saying, hey, the competition with me is off. He wrote me back. He's like, I have a family, I don't know what else I'm going to do with my life. And I really still enjoy this. And unlike me, he was like, I still have some goals that I want to achieve. Whereas I was kind of, like I told you earlier, I'd gotten to a point where I felt like I'd achieved all my goals. Yeah, he was like, I got a few more things I want to do, so I'm going to stick with it. And yeah, anyway, so then that was really sad. And it was weird for me because I'd really stepped away from the industry so much that I turned my back on the industry, that even showing up at his funeral was a little awkward for me because I just stepped out of skiing so much that in a way, for that period of time, I needed space.
Did you almost hate skiing because it put too much pressure or just mentally messed with you?
Yeah. I felt like I had like PTSD, and it was like there was so much pressure and there was so much ego and there was so much of my psyche like wrapped up into it in my identity that I was trying to separate my identity from the sport for a while to get into a healthier space. And I didn't stay in touch with anyone that year. And so I showed up at his funeral, but I hadn't been staying in touch with anyone. I'd really just walked away, and it was sad and shocking. Yeah, I mean, it was an awkward time for me because I was going through this transition of trying to reassess what I was going to be doing with my life. And at the same time, then Shane died, and it was just, I don't know, it was horrible.
Yeah, it was a terrible time. And then for you, you went between San Francisco and your Panama property. You get certified as a yoga instructor, and then Burning Man stuff. And you come to the realization that you love the mountains, that you live for the mountains, and you move back to Sun Valley. I would go into a lot more, but I don't have enough time because I've got to go pick up my brother who's having a procedure right now for some reason. And I don't even know all the details there, but I know he's going to be fine. But I still have a couple more questions for you, so we're not going to be done. But I am going to cut out a little bit of the stuff I was going to talk to you about. And now I have to figure out where I'm going to start back up with it. Well, I guess I should say right now, you're back in Sun Valley, and you've got a new real estate career. And anyone who's listening who wants to buy a property in Sun Valley, they should buy it from Kent. And if they do, Kent will take you out on a ski day. All you have to do is buy a house over $1 million, and you'll get a day skiing with Kent Kreitler, the living legend. But another living legend I need to talk about is who's doing inappropriate questions this week. So last week I said, hey, Kent, who would be the worst or who would be the best person that I could get to ask you inappropriate questions? And you said, Kristen Ulmer. I don't know Kristen Ulmer, but I started reaching out to her and I was able to connect with her. And we weren't able to record because we had switched this interview. It was supposed to be tomorrow, but we moved it up a day. And Kristen and I were going to talk later on this afternoon. So either way, she sent me over 3 inappropriate questions because she was excited that you didn't want her to ask them. And I've got the first one for you right now, and they're not that bad. So you don't even have to step outside away from whoever you're around. You can answer these right now. Here's number 1. Did you feel like you were a sex symbol during your ski career? If yes, what did that feel like? And how did you take advantage of it? If no, are you aware of the fact that you are in denial? Wink.
That's classic. No, I never considered myself. I never thought of myself that way. That's classic. That's funny. That's just Kristen. I'm glad she thinks I was.
Well, she probably saw that BK2 ad with you shirtless and was like, that's the sex symbol.
It's a big discussion I've never had. It would take some time to churn that one.
Okay. I will go with question number 2. You have been forthcoming in saying that you felt you had narcissistic tendencies in your past. How did they manifest back then or even recently? And how have you changed since? This is a good one.
That's interesting. I don't know. I think athletes, all of us want to be really good at what we do. And then narcissism is like being self-focused, I think. And, that's part of what I wanted to separate from that I realized was an unhealthy part of my identification with the sport is you get wrapped into, for me anyway, I got wrapped into self-promotion. No, that's part of the job, but they have to self-promote, but it's like you have to self-promote, and it's like there's so much self-focus and being your best at the sport. And like, in a way, I got to a point where I was like, am I contributing to the world at all? And so, as an athlete, I think there can be like a real unhealthy level of it takes so much to keep yourself at the top that there's an incredible amount of self-focus and narcissism involved in that.
Were you ever an asshole? Were you ever a cocky asshole, or were you always cool to people?
Both. If I disagreed with someone, I was always quite vocal about not agreeing with them. But I think, I don't know, in general, a pretty friendly guy. yeah, I mean, I think I was overall a good person, or I still am. I know I am. Like, I'll tell you one thing, like, you brought up the sex symbol thing or whatever, and people project their own shit onto you. And so me being in my position, being me, like having fun, being an attractive guy or whatever, and being really good at the sport, like a lot of times people just make an assumption, oh, well, he's got to be an asshole.
Yeah.
But anyone who knows me knows, I'm a good guy, and we can all be perceived as assholes, I guess. Yeah, it's hard to keep everyone happy all the time.
All right. Well, I've got your final inappropriate question. You and Shane McConkey were once partners in films. Tell us about the falling out and why you wanted to distance yourself from Shane.
There wasn't necessarily like a full falling out. Like I said, I think I've said it earlier, but we were like brothers. But Shane, his humor was great for a lot of people. I lived through it in college and afterwards. And speaking of inappropriate, like he did a lot of things, or he'd bring up like really inappropriate shit, like in front of your girlfriend, or he'd just start talking about things that aren't really socially acceptable.
Yep.
Yeah. So it wasn't so much like leaving Shane. I ended up developing some great friendships with a bunch of other guys, and Shane and I hung out a little less, but I think we always appreciated each other and got like a number of ski days in each year. But we went from like hanging out a ton to, and doing everything together to, not quite so much of that.
So does it just get old, that sense of humor, after 16 years of being just humiliated in front of people all the time?
Yeah, he was really immature, to be honest. And not that I was Captain Maturity or anything, but I kind of got tired of it a little bit. And then other people like Jake always loved it and like wanted more and more of it. Whereas I just gravitated towards a little different type of person.
All right. Well, those are inappropriate questions. And that's the podcast. And Kent, you have one of the most amazing careers of anyone in skiing, period. I mean, just the fact that you were able to put out 2 movie parts every year for like a decade, and all those parts had so many hammers in them, just like...
Hey.
What?
Wait, I gotta take this call.
So that was time with Kent Kreitler, and what a great story he has. Well, I feel like Kent has calmed down a lot in his old age. It sure was fun walking down memory lane with Kent and talking about the days when he was a brash, young badass innovating skiing. He comes from my favorite era of skiers, and it's always a treat to get some insight into what those times were like and who the players actually were as people. And Kent will be remembered as a hero and an innovator in skiing, the guy who took tricks to the backcountry, one of the big mountain pioneers, and it really was a pleasure to have him on the podcast. So thank you to Kent. Thank you to everyone for listening as well. That's the show for this week, and at this point, it is time for me to read the review of the week. It is a 5-star review. It comes from The Real Ben Wallace, and here is the review. Mike brings out the best in all his guests, isn't afraid to ask tough questions, and in general, is really entertaining to listen to. Even if you're not a diehard action sports fan, everyone can appreciate the stories, accomplishments, and personalities of guests that visit the show. Thank you for drastically improving my commute. Well, thank you, The Real Ben Wallace. I'm sure your commute does not exist anymore with this whole COVID thing. Hopefully you still listen because you're not commuting. But the beauty of this is I'll be able to find it out, because if you hear this in the podcast, all you need to do is email me and you're going to get yourself a Powell Movement beanie. Thank you for that review. And for those of you that are still listening, you are totally slacking on writing the reviews. I see how many of you listen each week, and I see how many reviews come in, and the number is totally disproportionate of what is supposed to happen, but that's all right. You might not have time to give me the review. But I like the engagement, and I believe it helps the show grow, and it's easy to do. Here are the steps you need to do to write me a review if you like this podcast, or if you hate this podcast, either way. 1. Click the podcast icon on your smartphone. 2. Search for the Powell Movement. 3. Click my logo. 4. Scroll down to where you see the stars. 5. Hit however many stars you think I deserve, and then write your review. It takes about a minute, and it is greatly appreciated. Thanks for taking the time to do it. And finally, I want to thank my amazing sponsors who make this show happen. They are Rollerblade, Peter Glenn Ski and Sports, the 10 Barrel Brewery, Stanley, and Elan Skis. Have a great week, everyone.